Hello.
Hey guys, and what were we saying, Josh? This is 16. What episode is this?
Oh, well, it looks like it's episode 16. I was not counting, to be honest. But yeah, here we are with episode 16, setting your standard when it comes to reconditioning. And so that's kind of the general topic for today, Bobby. And, of course, I have things to say on the topic, but, um, you know, we're talking, across the entire process from top to bottom, making sure that you have a plan for every unit that's going to go through your dealership. Not only a plan, but also a template for a story that you're gonna tell about that car. Um,
Yeah, and standardizing. When you leave, when you are standardizing, let's say you're kind of you're mapping out kind of how to handle cars in general. But if you could, the more you can communicate or have a standard in place, like we always say that recon usually doesn't go poorly because there's people that perform poorly. Recon usually goes poorly because there's a communication breakdown, right? And I think when you standardize the process, it just there's less communication that has to take place constantly throughout the recon process, right? Every and if you
100%.
and if you communicate that standard downstream to your people, then everybody's on the same page, and then it's just the exceptions that you have to communicate about, not everything, what to do with every single car, right?
Exactly. Because each of these units is ultimately unique, you know, we may get lucky and we have to do the same things over and over again, but ultimately each unit's gonna have its own specific trouble, it's gonna need a specific part, it's gonna need specific attention. Um, but the more that we can make that process the same for every unit, the less questions that people are going to ask, there's less slowdowns in the process as people try to reevaluate. Hey, what is it we're ultimately trying to achieve with this unit? Everybody understands. Hey, we're just trying to get these to the front line as fast as possible. But the problem is when you kind of take that flat approach with no dynamic whatsoever, you just take a flat approach to recon. Every car gets the same treatment. This is how we're going to do things for every car. You end up wasting your time on units that would be speedier through the process if you acknowledge that some cars are easier than others, and that not every car has to meet the same standard on our market.
So Josh, what would be a couple examples? Let's, for so everybody in the room kind of knows what we're talking about. So if we take in a car that is, 10 years old and it's got, it's in good shape, but it's got, 100,000 miles on it, right? You're going to throw it into the process, and then the same scope of communication that takes place for that car is going to have to go through all that when everybody knows damn well, okay, if it's 10 years old, it's not going to get a CPO. It's not going to get maybe a, the if you're doing like a powertrain warranty or whatever little something something, but everybody should already know how to treat that car, given that it's got the mileage in the year because of the marketability of that car. And
As
so, go ahead. I didn't. So, what if
I
you
was
want to
going to
jump in
say,
there?
we may not need the paint touch-up guy to, move on this unit necessarily. We may not need the rim repair guy to move on this unit, or we may not need to put it as through such a thorough inspection process in the shop. We may define that this unit is, like more of a first-time
And as
buyers,
is,
as is stop starts to your safety
yeah,
unit. And of
right.
course, a lot of dealerships already have that in place when it comes to the mechanical recon because they already understand targeting specific uh, price points. But the um, the overarching thing I want to emphasize in this meeting is that you ought to be doing the same thing for your cosmetic recon. Now, obviously, you don't want to sell ugly cars. You don't want to sell unsafe vehicles or dirty cars. But if you have a process, if you have a process in place that takes a flat approach to recon for every car, then your times will suffer. And it's important to define what is our standard for each of the units that we plan on frontlining, and um, defining that downstream for all the players. So not just the service department, but for the detail team and for each of the vendors that you expect to work on the cars. They should know what our top line vehicles are, what our mid tier vehicles are, and what our lower tier vehicles are in terms of what we're actually going to deliver in terms of recon. And the customer is also going to have a different relationship to that vehicle as well. And it's important to acknowledge that uh, when it comes
As
to
long as
recon.
those damn salespeople aren't sticking their foot in their mouth, right? But so Josh, how would we classify that? Some stores I know like the Sonic Group has like A B cars and CD cars, A, B, C, and D. Would you suggest that they kind of have a kind of a matrix of if it's this year, this model, or whatever, this amount of mileage, it's going to get this. And then along with that too, maybe having some budget set up to where that if the vehicle's expected or if the vehicle's reconditioning cost is under a certain amount, then service can just roll it. You don't have to, you know, put it in the UCM approval step and wait for the used car manager to react.
Exactly. With our best stores, they have that exact process in place. They define an A car, a B car, a C car. They define those tiers of the price points. And then they also define what is the threshold for requiring direct manager oversight over approving the recon costs. So for each of those cars, for each of those tiers, it's A tier. I'm willing to spend 2 grand on average on recon per unit. On average, I'm not going to spend 2 grand per car, but on average for my higher tier cars, maybe even more depending on what manufacturer. And then the mid tier and the lower tier, the B and the C tiers, those also have their own expenditure limit. And so as long as our expenditures go underneath that, then we can pre-approve the units, we can move them along in the process. We don't have to stop midway to get approval from the sales team in order to get parts delivered on time.
And I always recommend as a best practice, give the shop a budget, right? And I know there's a little bit of a uncomfortable factor to that because let's say I gave the shop $1,500. Let's say on my A or my B cars, you got a $1,500 budget. If it's under $1,500 or under an olive recon, just go ahead and roll it, right? I don't need to approve it. But on that same note, I don't need every car out there costing me $1,500, right? The shop's going to work their pay plan. And so, I say that's a best practice, but what comes with that is, you're required to have a certain culture, right? And I can't, I say culture all the time, but there's got to be some good relationship between the used car department and the service department when managing these budgets, right? I'm not going to, if I'm trying to make, work my pay plan, I want to make every car $1,500 and just roll it through, throw them a bone. Not every cream puff's going to be $1,500. If all it needs is some filters and an oil change and whatever, yeah, throw them the bone for $600-800 for those, lease trade in, those lease turn ins or those low mileage vehicles.
Yeah, and I've seen, that relationship be productive and healthy where the technicians understand what's required for each unit. They know what the expectation for the used car manager is because they're in communication. And when we are deploying our tools in stores like that, everyone has a sigh of relief because now it's so much easier to do what they were already doing, what they had to stop what they were doing to walk across the dealership to do in the past. Now they have a tool, one-stop shop for documenting everything. Not that this is a sales pitch, but the point being that for those dealerships that emphasize that communication and setting that standard, and also communicating that downstream and making sure that everybody down the line understands, from the technician to the detailer, what do these price points mean in terms of what we're delivering. Um, it just helps everything gel along, just like you were saying, Bobby. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
but
and so communicating that is that's a big deal, and it does require a good relationship between sales and
oh yeah,
service.
exactly. On that note, I was just going to say, a good relationship and a good culture, those can come quite easily if you set expectations correctly. And part of setting those expectations is setting your standard and communicating that. But if two people are not sure who's responsible for what or who ought to make what decision, um, uh, or who should have overriding responsibility for the process. If that's unclear, then it's going to be difficult for those two people to have a good relationship because things are too ambiguous between them. They're never quite sure if something that the other person does is going to fall back on them. But when you have those clean, defined standards, and in our workflow, I think that's like the best way of visually representing that is having that step by step process that each person takes responsibility for, because
Hmm.
that's really ultimately the best way to do this thing. Because throughout the dealership, there every individual has their own main job that they're doing. Typically, it's it's not it's becoming less uncommon, but it's not common that there are committed individuals in every department that are looking at recon. It should be, but it's not very common. And the parts department is trying to sell parts and acquire parts. The service department is trying to get their service waiters serviced. The sales
Mhm.
department is trying to sell cars. In the meantime, people are trying to fit recon in where they can. Now, we make it easy. We systematize the whole process of creating and assembling that team and making that culture. But it really does start with defining a standard, and not only a standard for the units, but a standard for the people involved in the process. What is it that they're directly responsible for? What is it that I expect them to do in their part of the process when they take custody of a unit? When that happens, that is the foundation for that good culture, for that good relationship to emerge because we're all on the same page. We're sticking together.
Yep. And I always say another thing to do, identify some of these things that bring back the trade walk, right? I still feel like trade walks. I kind of told you beforehand, Josh, I was going to bring this up, but that's just another way to just set the communication, even though there is a standard, right? But hey, this is an A car, this is a B car, and here you can put the tags in Rapid Recon Pro if you're using that. You can tag these vehicles so everybody knows downstream how to handle these vehicles. So.
Yeah, 100%. Using tags, using notes, using a foursquare on the window, having that trade walk, regardless of whether or not it's a trade walk. I mean, of course, I'm going to go for, I'm always going to recommend the best practice, which is the trade walk. But if you just have a standardized intake process where you do at the initial outset when you receive the car, you define this is what I'm, and it's really important that you do this. It's very important that you, when you first get the car in, that you define this is my price point for this vehicle. This is my expectation, because that's going to shape the narrative for that car. What you're going to emphasize ultimately when you sit down with the customer, when you talk about recon with the customer, because that's what you're going to do. Because you're proud of your store, your cars stand tall. You want to be able to represent your reconditioning process. In order to get to that point with the customer where you can proudly represent your recon, you need to set that standard. You need to make sure the standard is being followed.
Yeah, not only speeding up the process, you also want to make sure you're not over reconditioning vehicles if it
Yes.
doesn't call for it, or
Yeah.
under reconditioning vehicles. Because if you're
Yeah.
under, like just kind of what you alluded to, Josh, if you're under reconditioning the vehicles, we don't want to have to be apologizing for our cars, right?
Yeah. We
Because we
don't
don't
want
want
B
to put any
bags.
money into them, B
Yeah.
backs, comebacks, or
And it affects our reputation.
yeah, yeah. So, or over reconditioning the cars, right? And so that can be a consideration too. Now, not we're not in all the, for managers, conveying maybe being a little more thorough in the intake process of communicating what is really. I love my recon to only be $1,000 on this car. You can't throw it in there wishing and hoping. Be realistic. If it needs tires, probably the largest expenditure for used car reconditioning is tires. Put it in there, account for that, right? It doesn't mean that's what you hit, but we could be a little more realistic on the intake side of what these vehicles need.
Yeah. That intake process really does go hand in hand. The trade walk, it goes hand in hand with setting your standard. Once you define the standard, that should be the very next thing that as a dealer I would want to do. If I was sitting down, I was wanting to get my recon process in order. I would define the price points for my market. What segment of the market am I focusing on? The majority of my vehicles, what am I selling? Am I selling the A cars? Am I selling the mid-tier vehicles? Am I mostly selling, low mileage, newer units, or do I have older units in stock? Once you understand what your market dynamics are, that helps you define the price point that you're working with primarily, and then that helps you to set your standard for each vehicle so that you don't end up under or over reconning. Of course, the risk with under reconning is, you have maybe legal troubles at the worst, or your reputation gets impacted,
Hmm.
which is very important. So, lifeblood of your dealership is how customers perceive their interaction with you once they've walked away. It's not about selling cars, right? Because you can sell a car and the customer can still be kind of pissed off when they drive off your lot, right? You could still have achieved the sale, but they're never coming back for any other service. They're not coming
Yeah.
back for this or that. Especially if a customer drives off and then they discover something is broken that you didn't mention to them, they are going to hate you forever because they just committed
Yep.
to paying payments on a vehicle for whatever term, and now they've got to deal with this extra expense. So it really is a terrible hit to your reputation, and you get in
And
trouble with consumers.
And not to mention
So
reducing the WEOs. Everybody would love to reduce the amount of WEOs, after the fact promises. People coming back to the dealership, because we had to promise this and that. Make sure your vendors are getting on these cars. If you set the standard, then the vendors know. Relay that to your vendors as well. Um, but another thing I wanted to mention, Josh, too, and I think we were running into it less and less, but I've actually come across a couple stores that I've done consultations with, a couple dealerships nationwide, that still are just the importance of a dedicated team of technicians, right? Because we're talking about standardizing. What happens, and anybody who runs recon in a dealer knows this, when you start handing out cars to the main population of technicians, that they're trying to squeeze these cars in between customer pay. They may not be on the same page as the used car theory
the
and what we're
program,
trying to
yeah,
accomplish. Right. So for the people, if you got an internal advisor trying to manage it, it's like herding cats, right? Everything's wrong with the car. The guy that does used cars once every blue moon is going to try and cover his ass, or he thinks that the used car department has an open checkbook, and it's just things go sideways. So
yeah,
if you're going to standardize some things, you want to standardize mentality as well. So please, as a best practice, form a dedicated team, whether you got your internal advisor, right, and then you got your used car specific technicians. And I know in some of the smaller volume stores and the small, it's a little tough to allocate resources just to focus on used cars. But then again, those smaller operations, it's easier to lose focus and lose cars, right? Things slip through the cracks, which where our tool comes in key. But it's especially, I'm big on culture. If we make sure that you've, dedicated team of technicians doing nothing but used cars, that will really help with your standardization of your process.
yeah, 100%. And what's great about that is, when I walk into a store where they have the dedicated techs, I can really tell how long they've had that relationship based on the rapport that I have with the techs and the rapport, like what they already know about the used car manager's expectations. That tells me a lot about, not only is this a dedicated team, but this is an experienced dedicated team. And so they already know when they're looking at a unit precisely what it is that the used car manager expects in terms of putting that estimate together, including photos, including the correct pricing points, and then also just the inspection itself, making sure that that's, once again, that we're not overcommitting resources to something that ultimately we're going to be selling, not as a certified unit. So it doesn't have all of the, 350 point manufacturer required checks. Uh, you know, of course, for the majority of our customers, I doubt that their technicians are performing, certified inspections on every car. But that's just an example of where resources could be lost. And really, you see a lot of that with the vendors instead. You see the vendors, I've seen dealers, they have a relationship with the vendor. The vendor touches every car no matter what. That can cause bottlenecks in your process. Even it's important if you're working with vendors a lot in your process that you sit down with them and you also define with them what your price points are, what you're targeting, what your A car looks like, what your B car looks like, and the expectation there, so that they don't end up wasting their time or money on a vehicle that doesn't need that level of reconditioning.
You gotcha. Good stuff. Good stuff.
Yeah, I can't tell, our little module for participants. Oh, okay, it looks like he's 0. I guess we missed him because we did it at the last week of the month, Bobby.
Oh,
Uh,
that could be
this
it. That
this
could
is
be
our
it. We,
our
we did
punishment.
shift. Hey,
Yeah.
that's okay. That's okay.
Well,
No, this is good.
our loyal listeners said, "Last week of the month? Heck no."
Right. Um, no, but it's an important topic, and it's worth, at least getting the recording out there that, uh, there's enough money in doing recon well to really put a lot of thought behind your process. And, standardizations have been a big thing. um, make sure people are using the tool as a standard, as a part of your culture. the tool. If you are using Recon, again, we don't sales pitch this, but yeah, we have tools that I wish I had back when I was managing Recon. I was the king of Google Docs. Oh, I got this cool, I can share it with everybody, but I still have to run across the dealership and tell somebody to look at it and to
I,
put
I
some
had a
information
guy
in.
I had a guy proudly, he had a Google Doc as well, Bobby. He showed me all the bells and whistles. It had, green, yellow, red that came on with the time.
Hmm. Yep,
It was
I did a
synced
similar thing.
perfectly, and he was really proud of it, but he was proud to show me it going away. He was happy to say that this was no longer what he was utilizing. And that was way back 2 or 3 years ago when Recon Velocity and even Rapid Recon weren't to the standard that they are now.
Hmm.
So I've seen the spreadsheet, okay? I've seen the bells and whistles. It's just not enough.
Yeah.
But regardless of that, obvious, of course we're both going to say that, but we've seen it and we've seen the influence it has. But to reemphasize the point, how this fits into the topic, a lot of dealers they'll take on our tool, but they're still texting and emailing and still walking across the dealership to ask questions of people who are in the middle of their job.
Yep.
Rather than utilizing the very convenient, phone app or the website. So
Hmm.
it seems obvious, but it's really important for leaders, especially when you start to see people getting away from that expectation that everything needs to be in the one place. Just reemphasize with them, re-engage them on that point. Make sure they understand that this is helpful for everyone down the line because there's less questions. And every time I stop what I'm doing to walk over to someone else's desk, stop what they're doing, have a conversation about the vehicle, we waste our own time there, obviously. But that conversation just happened between the two of us. So if it was relevant to someone downstream of the process, they're not going to find out about it. We're going to have to do that again.
Yep.
So you can, and I've had dealers. I had one guy really say like, "Oh, you just don't want people to talk face to face anymore." It's like, no, dude, no,
Right.
absolutely not. Like, it just has to do with process efficiency. It's got nothing to do with your relationship to technology or
Yeah, you
whatever.
can you can you can you can see each other face to face when you're celebrating cutting your Recon in half.
Yeah,
That's
and
that's when you.
you can still have the conversation with the guy. Just turn on your little transcribe or whatever. Just make sure that it gets into the story for the vehicle. Because once again, and a lot of the most experienced
Yeah.
used car dealers are going to tell you this, that the narrative for your cars is super important because that establishes that relationship with the customer. You need to have that trust and that transparency when you sit down with them, when you're finally getting that deal ready to go. And having your process set down and knowing your people are keeping to it and having that documentation there is going to be such a great boon for getting the trust of the customer and then ultimately making the deal at the price point that you want because
And I
they're
did.
go ahead.
No, no. I love our new AI feature that we have built into Velocity Engage, right? Where not only does it tell you why this car is the best car on the planet, right? Or whatever is cool about this car, it will also, oh, by the way, this is what we did to the car when it went through the shop. It's got new brakes, it's got a new battery, whatever. So it extracts that from the repair information, the closed RO information, and will share that information in an AI description. So, I mean, we are, starting to leverage not only, moving over to Rapid Recon Pro, which has, is the future of Rapid Recon. Um, Basically, leveraging the AI technology within there too. We even have a little AI thing that will translate into any language, almost every language. But you got Spanish, French, Chinese. If you got people and there's
That is
language barriers in the
huge
notes,
for a lot of our dealers in the
yeah.
Midwest, in the South. They have a lot of Spanish language folks that are working in different capacities for them and they
Hmm.
don't speak English, and the conversation and all, they'll say things to me like, oh, they just don't understand, or
Yeah.
they're ignorant, and then you actually go and you use your translator app, and they're not so ignorant, and they
No,
do
don't confuse.
understand,
Yeah, don't
you
confuse
know.
lack of language. Don't confuse language barrier with stupidity. That is not the case. Those people are smart. They get it.
It's
I can almost do charades with somebody who I don't speak with, and they'll get it, right? So
Yeah, and the real problem there is that you've got a great resource, an individual who's intelligent, who's going to do good work for you, who can communicate with you. It's just you're the one on the other side who's not utilizing their resources to meet them where they're at and make sure
mm,
that you can get the most out of their productive capacity. Because if you treat them like they're stupid, they're going to start acting like they're stupid because it's easier that way. It's easier to act like a fool. So before I get on my soapbox, let me just say that AI summary feature and the translation there is going to be really helpful. And I hope
yeah.
that that will help a lot of our dealers overcome their initial, reaction to the language barrier, and
Yeah, and for anybody
hopefully.
watching this, yeah, so if you're just on a recon tool, we have another part of our tool called Rapid Engage, right? So we've got a tool to get cars through the shop faster. Here's a tool to help you sell them faster, right? And it kind of trickles over to the fixed op side, and it, puts window sticker, AI descriptions, things like that. Not to mention, while we have a few minutes left, I am currently at Tampa Honda down here in Florida, and we are beta testing CDK integration. Right, we're starting with CDK. We eventually want to work our way through all of the DMSs, but we're currently working on testing, currently up and running, basically creating an estimate in Rapid Recon Pro, right? And then when these items are approved, they can be pushed right to CDK. So we can open an RO with the inspection line on it, send it to the managers. They can see what to approve and decline, and then the service side, after they get that information back, can go ahead and sync with the DMS or push to CDK,
Is
and
that a
those
one
lines.
button press, Bobby?
Yeah, yeah. So it'll take all you verify all the approved items. You even has drop downs where it fills in all your opcodes. So you can search like UVP. Here it's UVP, used vehicle inspection, right? Call it UVP and it comes up. If you put in tires, it will pop up all your tire opcodes. So when you're building the estimate, you can pretty much have all the opcodes in there, put a description so the managers can understand what they're approving and declining, right? Pricing, labor prices, parts prices, and then when those managers approve and decline certain things on that estimate, you can hit a button and all the approved items will push lines to the RO. You did not have to leave Rapid Recon Pro and go over to CDK, and it
It
is
sounds like
pretty.
we're really trying to hit the ground running with this one out of
Yeah,
beta
yeah, yeah,
testing.
and when
Because
it
that's a
is
full suite of features. You say it like it's just one thing, but that's actually five separate things, right? You know what I
kind
mean?
of, yeah, yeah, it's one stop shopping the approval process and getting everything over the DMS. Especially, I'm a fan of having these lines already on the RO by the time it makes it to parts, because a
I
lot of
mean, come
times we're
on.
writing
Yeah, the parts
we're writing
lookup.
the we're writing these internal tickets, right? And we get the approval, and maybe they didn't have time to put the lines in there. So parts has no choice but to bill out all the parts on the first line. And that there's a lot of people who are going to watch this that know exactly what I'm talking about. So because it's an internal ticket, we can just leave the parts on the first line. Just make sure we get the labor for the battery and the tires and the brakes and stuff. But all the parts are up here. Well, some dealerships or some companies want it broken out. So you got to take and move the parts. You got to move the brake parts to the brake line, the tires to the tire line. And somebody's got to go through and do that before they undo, finish out the RO. If
Yeah.
this if th- when this is in place, all those lines are going to be there in the snap of a finger, and then we move the cars downstream and parts has each line that on the RO that they can build these parts out on. So it's pretty awesome and we're looking
Yeah.
forward to it.
That's going to make Rapid Recon Pro the killer app in the
Yep.
reconditioning space.
Yep.
Uh, if you
100%.
took away all the other features, honestly, if you took away the app mentions, the tags, if you took away the reporting features, if all it did was that, I think a lot of our dealers would choose that over every
we
other
and we
competitor.
brought it up and we were demoed it a little bit at NADA. We were bringing it up and everybody's eyes lit up. Anybody you talk to out there, oh hey, what if our tool, you know hand
What if it could whisper to your DMS softly
yeah, and
and
just put
just
things
wait?
over there, right? So handshaking. So we're starting with CDK. Hopefully we'll work our way through all the other ones in short order after that, but so far so good. So we're just out here ironing out the
Ambitious
wrinkles.
marching orders, Bobby. I like it.
I know, so that's it.